I will present to you today a paper. The paper which I drafted, or the first version thereof, last year for a conference, also here in Copenhagen, on law and political economy. And now this paper is being finalized, but in the meanwhile, this paper basically became a certain, let's say, prelude to a bigger project on, in the book project, that will deal with legal imaginaries and social change. And now the title has actually changed in the last week to legal imaginaries and collective self-determination. Anyway, so in a way, what I will do is to look a little bit more into my theoretical framework and then take you through a couple of other things. But if I'm a little bit dwelling too long on abstract issues, please forgive me, because I will need that at some point, likely. So try to focus and bear with me. So the main goal of the paper and the book later on is to explore how our ideas about economy shape the ways we think about law and over time, and how our ways about law shape the ways in which we think about economy. I focus in the paper that I will present to you today on private law. It doesn't have to be necessarily private law, but it is private law here, and I would say for two main reasons. First is internal to private law. So, and private lawyers would very much recognize themselves in that. So, for example, from the beginning, from the 19th century onwards, many sociologists have said that private law, contract law, has been fundamental to the creation of the markets. On the other hand, if you look at the legal discourse, it has been very isolationist. So it has basically rejected, especially in its beginnings, any connection with, or very most of the connection, at least the mainstream one, connection with economy and politics, and postulated, that private law is based on things such as promise, certain kind of moral understanding of contract and private law. So this would be one reason. So how comes there is this disparity? How the discourses which are presumed to be separate in the end happen to be the fundaments of something else which they fail to recognize as being relevant to them. Second reason is more general, of course, and there we know that private law is an important instrument for instituting markets. So, for example, if you look at World Bank or International Monetary Fund, they would often see enforcement of contract and the right of property as the core things that presents rule of law. So, the private law is the thing that the big financial institutions consider to be the core for the institutions and institutions of economy. The EU also has increasingly seen private law as core to instituting a particular kind of market. But it has looked a little bit at a different phase of the EU. It has focused very much on consumer issues. And it has seen consumer law as one of the major aspects of its social phase within its policies. So it's almost like economic policy, which is social policy at the same time. So ultimately, if I'm to rephrase what I'm after in this paper, is to say that I want to look at what is that we are saying when we say, as the European Union, that we use consumer law or private law as means to constrain markets. So on what kind of understanding or conceptions of market do we base such claims, as well as on what conceptions of law do we draw upon when we make such claims. So the fact that I'm not changing this is on purpose, so don't worry. This can very much frustrate me. So the main argument that I would like to make in this presentation is that economic discourse and legal discourse and rules, however much isolation, for instance, especially the legal scholars would like to assume, have historically shared a set of fundamental pre-understandings as to what is the relevant socioeconomic whole, and who and how can and should intervene on it. And this is something that this set of pre-understandings, in a way, is the joint social imaginary on which this discourse is built. And it is because of let's say, symmetrical institutionalizations of those basic parameters of social organizations that we see law mainly as supportive of economy and current socio-economic organization, rather than somehow subverting it or bringing about social change. All these utopistic visions that we have. But at the same time, this is not completely true, what I'm saying. So I think that exactly because of this interconnectedness in these basic parameters, if law is to achieve social change on a more larger scale than basically small improvements of particular small relations or issues, what it needs to do is to destabilize certain of those parameters. So what is what is the social whole, and what is the boundary, for example, between natural and social, economic and political? I will come back to this, but it is so there is a way how we can think about social change through law. However, it has to cut deeper than what we normally think of when we want to change stuff through law. Okay, and now we go to the outline. So the presentation should have 5 parts. In the first one, I would speak a little bit about the concept of legal imaginaries and explain its relation to law, economic, and politics. Try to little bit flesh out what I mean by shared pre-understandings. In the second part, I then develop analytics, whereby I point to 3 socioeconomic imaginaries and their laws. The laws they produce, basically that complement each other or that corroborate each other in some ways. The third part, we deal with how a new imaginary. So then I focus. There are 3 imaginaries in the second part, and in the third part, I flesh out a little bit more how can we observe the shift from one imaginary to another, and I look at the EU consumer policy to show you how these parameters are changing. And then in the fourth part, I will look at some impacts at substantive consumer law. I don't know whether this is of sufficient interest. We can jump over to bonus if I have enough time. So part 1 deals with social. I think I can go already to this. With the concept of social imaginary. So this is the quote that you would find in the very fascinating book of Charles Taylor, Social Imaginary. I confuse them with Castoriadis, but so basically Charles Taylor has published a book in 2004 which concerns social imaginaries. And the way he describes it or tries to capture it is to say that a social imaginary stands for the ways in which people imagine their social existence, how they fit together with others, how things go on between them and their fellows, the expectations that are normally met, and the deeper normative notions and images that underlie these expectations. So in another way, or how you could say a very similar thing, and I think he goes on at some length about those issues in his book, is to say that social imaginaries basically constitute certain shared pre-understandings as to what constitutes social existence, including such things as how economy, society, human relations, nature of politics fit together. And these kind of pre-understandings will change, they change over time. So certainly in the medieval times, we have had very different ones than we have today. Now, more specifically, what I aim to show then in the following part of the paper is that economic, political, and legal imaginaries found their common foundation, or these pre-understandings, in deeper social imaginaries, which converged at least 2 or 3 different levels. First one is that of what is the nature of the social world, what constitutes the social whole, and the measure to which this social whole is transformable. So, and there we would think about the construction of various kinds of boundaries between the social and natural, constructed and given. And in European law, very often we talk about construction of boundary between economic and political. But so, which is a certain way of articulating what the social whole is. So, what the EU can intervene on and what it cannot, or similarly. So. Another dimension in which those imaginaries or those discourses tend to converge is at least the mainstream one, so the dominant one. So in this paper, I mainly focus on the dominant discourses and dominant institutionalizations of discourses. The second dimension is to say that they share, that these economic, political, legal discourses share two other things, namely who are the subjects, actors, collectivities, or groups who can intervene in socio-economic process, and finally certain understanding of how they can do that. Now, I know it is slightly, let's say, questionable concept, but I think just by means of illustration, we could think, or we could experiment together. Let me think together about neoliberalism or some understandings of these concepts, and how do they fit into what I've been saying so far. So, if we think about neoliberalism as a social imaginary, we could say that it presents a new understanding as to what is the social whole in which should be intervened, who is to intervene in it, and how. So, for example, I think on many interpretations of this term, people would say that neoliberalism would elevate to the main social whole, that of the market, national, regional, global. The mode of intervention would be, on the one hand, market optimization somehow, on the other hand, spread of market rationalizing principles, competition into other spheres. And finally, it is also the imaginary which would both see would harness somehow market useful subjectivities and actors, and also postulate that we all need to work in common interest to optimize those markets, because that is in the interest of all, and whether you want to tie to trickle-down effect or such things. But in a way, so that would be the kind of the basic underlying kind of image of how the world fits together. Now, all those big social imaginaries are somehow articulated in disciplinary discourses, at least some, where I can speak about for legal discourse here, and we could see that, for example, from the 80s onwards, there are certain transformations in the ways we think about law. At least some significant parts of law start to be very much focused on the market, and we see it even in the changing names of certain fields of law. So, for example, labor law has been talked about in the past 20 years as the law of labor market. Consumer protection has changed name to consumer law. So on many different levels, somehow market becomes center around which we should think when we think about those types of law. It produces certain also legal imaginary. So what is the appropriate role of law vis-a-vis all those, vis-a-vis the market? And there it is really the imaginary whereby a law needs to somehow facilitate the market, harness actors which can be helpful to construction of markets. I guess my favorite is the internal market useful actors. So there is a whole private law is populated by policies which aim to help those actors to deliver on better internal market. So this is not to say that they are not some other kinds of, let's say, imaginaries which we can see within the times that neoliberal social imaginary is somehow dominant, and we can think, for example, of more interventionist legal imaginaries, such as GDPR. So when we actually think of law as being somehow actually properly normative, when it comes before the market, and then tries to steer the development, or precautionary principle. It's very much based on the similar kind of idea. However, these kinds of laws are generally, unless very well institutionalized, they tend often to come under attack. The case is the data protection is now very much disputed or tried to be circumvented in the framework of global trade. trade deals such as TTIP or those things. The same goes for precautionary principle. I just read 2 articles recently that innovation principle seems to be postulated as a counterbalance, very much put forward and supported by very large corporations. So that is kind of example of what social imaginary may mean. And we now go to part 2. I've done this in such a way that your bandwidth is not too preoccupied. Where are we? So, in the part 2, out of 4, possibly 5 parts. I'm sorry, I'm abusing you a little bit. In the part 2, then in the paper, I aim to kind of show how we can infer these basic social imaginaries by looking at symmetries between economic thought on the one hand and legal rules and discourses on the other over the course of 200 years. So, of course, the relationship between law and economy has been articulated in many different kinds of ways in law or other fields of science. But what I'm trying to show is really that there are certain ways in which we can make generalizations that reach far beyond our contemporary context. So therefore, I try to infer what are these underlying shared imaginaries, looking at symmetries between those 2 bodies of social action and social spheres. And I will try to show how they mirror, these 2 parts, the same pre-understandings as to what is the social whole, who and how can intervene on it in different historical periods. I will use, in this way, this is important to add, we make sure that the stable kinds of societies are produced. These are kind of the paradigms which emerge in certain historical periods. Now, as for periodization, I don't take blame for it. More or less, I will follow, for the reasons of length, what Duncan Kennedy proposes in 3 Globalizations of Legal Thought. But there are many similar periodizations, so I don't think it's too crazy or too risky to just go with it. And because 20 years more or less doesn't really matter. What I try to show is less related to that. One more thing. So what you get here is, of course, somehow reduced glimpse of the second part of the paper. The last glimpse is going to be then developed in the 3rd part, so that you will get a little bit more body there. So what we do now are basically the glimpses. So if you look at the first socioeconomic imaginary, let's say, which would date from the 19th century to some beginning of the 20th century, we can find a couple of symmetries between the way we have thought about economy on the one hand and how private law rules and principles have been set. So I really look there at structures, not so much at discourse. So on the side of economic imaginary, the kind of basic discourse was that as market as natural entity, where invisible hand somehow coordinates, and the economic laws can be deduced by reasoning. And in order to do so, we just assume that people carry certain characteristics, and then we can model from those characteristics further. So. I think that's quite self-obvious. So the idea of the individual there is that of autonomous, self-interested individual who knows best his interest. And in terms of political intervention, by some authors, it is portrayed as harmful. So, whatever you do, you basically just produce negative effects in the market. If you regulate hours of work, poor people will not be able to get as much work as they need. So whatever you do, that will produce negative effects. Or those who, like Adam Smith, who were much more positive about market, would say there is some suffering, but ultimately markets, promises progress, and if we just leave it, it's going to self-coordinate. In any case, political intervention there is either then harmful or futile. It doesn't really matter. In private law rules, what is quite interesting, that if you think that here the market as natural entity is the social whole, Private law is not interested at all in the social whole, so it's not busy with the whole. It's focused on the person, on the idea of pacta sunt servanda, certain moral conceptions of the duty to fulfill the promise. So all is based about a rather thick concept of personhood, the right to property, freedom of contract, responsibility for his action. Of course, he's in this period. Now, the rights and duties in private law follow also logical principles of deduction from first principles such as free will or autonomous subject. And finally, experts in this period are best placed to figure out what those rules are. So it's not the politics. So in all those dimensions, even if the discourse or the reasoning may be different, ultimately they boil down to the same thing. So you have the focus is on individuals, so on micro level. Social change, if it happens, it's some kind of organic process driven by capable individuals or technological progress. And there is very little role for collective action and law, and private law in particular here. So it kind of is something that does not intervene into what society should do bottom up somehow. So the second imaginary is the, let's say, market as a political project, and which is comes with the rise of the social and legal thought. So if you think about the ways in which economy or market has been imagined in this period, it has been seen very much as constructed. So the rise of institutional economics, later macroeconomics and Keynesianism, basically postulate that, at least the latter ones, postulate that economic processes are knowable and can be changed to achieve political goals, of course, such as full employment. And the goals, of course, of this should be set in politics, in democratic politics, which is on its own imagined as a struggle and compromise between different groups. And it is the collective actors that gain importance in this period. The rise of industrial relations, neo-corporativism. The colleague from CBS works on that, Paul Kier. So all those developments. On the side of the private law, so private law is reinterpreted. Not so much as this moral thingy, but as a certain infrastructure for economic relations, and its distributive effects are recognized very strongly by legal realists, but also, from Germany to Nordic countries, also importantly, your legal realists. So the private law is seen as infrastructure of economic relations, distributive, and therefore also it should be used as means to pursue social goal and social justice. Critiques usually talk about it as the instrumentalization of private law. What this actually means in practice is that we have desegregation or falling apart of contract law in particular, where we see the emergence of different both groups and different who have their own laws, labor law, consumer law, tenancy law. Again, critiques have been calling this the neo-feudalization of private law, referring namely to this renewed focus on groups and their different interests. And then politics, of course, and legislative intervention is the major venue how to intervene in the Professorenrecht, so the prior civil codes, which are very much based on this deductive reasoning from first principles. So again, in terms of, and if you look at some kind of imaginary, and I always like to look at the way how, or focus on the way the change is imagined, you would see that the socio-economic reality is presented very much as constructed. The main agent of change are the groups rather than individuals, and change takes place by politics, and with a very significant role of law or attributed to law. This changes in the following period, and this may become already for lawyers will become much more of a known thing. So how with the critiques of the social welfare state in the 70s, both left and right in some ways reject the welfare state. Yeah. Unfortunately, if somehow the left or the critical left has criticized the overgrown bureaucracy of the welfare states, etc., the right, the critique of non-efficiency of the welfare state seems to have then dominated politically. So in this legal imaginary or economic imaginary, markets get to the center stage. And this goes very much along the lines of what I've already mentioned before. There is a very strong idea of the international competitiveness as the major driver or the major concern of governments. The idea that if in reaction to these failures of the welfare state, we need to introduce certain rationalizing market principles into various kinds of institutions, private and public, in order to improve their functioning. A political narrative is that of common interest. So we all, whether we are consumers, workers, tenants, we are at the same time something else. So we have all the common interest, and our common interest is indeed to make the market work better. And that kind of turns into private law, which is very much geared toward optimization of international markets and harnessing individuals which aim to or should contribute to market functioning and market dynamism. Very important. So if you look at the kind of idea of social change which is behind behind this. In this period, the central one that would really focus on the macro level of the market, and the social change comes if we manage to improve or optimize the market functioning of the whole market. So the goal of politics, of actors, of law is to facilitate this market functioning, improve competitiveness, and achieve all possible kinds of goods. Now, brief, we go to the third part, where I try to a little bit flesh out this transformation, which goes from market as a political project to market as a means of rationalization of social action. So there are many possible ways, of course, in which we could have looked at it, but I've chosen to look at the ways in which Commission frames its consumer policy. And basically, these are documents. Of course, there are many actors behind those. There are disagreement in the Commission. There is a lot of things happening, of course. Different actors would receive those documents in different ways. But I think what it really allows us to see is what is the kind of language that Commission thought, or that the relevant Directorate General thought would be winning them support they want in this regard. So. Okay, and now we'll have a lot of quotes. So I look at the consumer policies from 81 to the last one, which is 2012, and I try to kind of point you to certain things that are relevant. So if you look at the 81 consumer policy, we still talk about balance of interest between market forces. And we see consumer in a way as somebody who needs to be equipped with rights, also the right to representation in order to engage in balancing market forces. So in a way, if you look at this document, you would really see that it is based on a certain imaginary that sees politics and market in a way as conflict between different interests, between different groups. And consumers in this regard need to be equipped with rights in order to further their interests. So different other things you could draw from these documents are not so much important, I guess, for you in this format, but so the whole idea, for example, of information duties, which also appears later but changes entirely, is that the information duties should be provided by public, so that consumers have actually true information and can actually act in the market to advance their interests. So they should not be given partial information by those who are basically their enemies in the market. namely the businesses. Then that changes very much so. So in the 91, which is, so it's after the white paper on the completion of the internal market, we already see that the Commission starts to bring the language of the market much more into the prominence in consumer policy, and speaks about the importance of addressing consumer concerns in the concentrated preparations for the internal market. But still, if you look at what are the kind of things they propose, it is the focus is on consumer representation. So to have strong advocates of consumer interests, consumer information, which is also still delivered by public means. Importantly, transparency and comparative testing. So again, equipping consumers with objective information. Now, if we go down the line, we come to the main moment of change and like major discursive shift. So seven years after the 91. And here we already see that different things are expected from consumers. So consumers so the new implements from consumer policy should be matched with new maturity on the part of consumers and their representatives. They should be need to understand the interlinkages between their interests and those of others. Consumers themselves can recognize and accept such trade-offs because they are not only consumers but taxpayers, employees, and beneficiaries of public policies too. They can also accept that they have responsibilities and that their immediate interests as consumers have to be reconciled with longer-term concerns for the environment and society. So consumer interests are equitably reconciled with those of other stakeholders, and this reconciliation is a positive sum game. So it is really much creating a kind of not docile, but mature consumers who are aware that their interests are, and that they have common interests with other stakeholders in the society, and that interest is in fact a positive sum game, because if we improve the market functioning, we can get only good things out of that. So I didn't mention it with the previous slide in 91. So what happens in that year, and where we can still see that the Imaginaries, the old one, is that the European Commission starts investing a lot of money to create independent consumer associations across Europe. So there is very strong financing going on, and what actually, and these are then also the main consumer associations today. But with this change of language, these associations that are expected to be, which are financed by the EU, now the bread giver is also articulating certain expectations as to how they are supposed to behave in the policy process. Now, not that they are fulfilling that, but it's in a way there is this kind of there is a strange aftertaste that in a way something which was meant to be really a force for protection of consumers' interests now becomes in some way legitimating for the consumer policy, which is very conciliatory and ultimately about what the European Commission wants. Okay, so in 2001, this kind of narrative or language becomes even more geared toward making internal market and market function better, and the expectations from consumers go not only with regard to how to behave to other interests, but also how they're supposed to behave in the market itself. So they're supposed to search out for bargains, optimize their consumption decisions, increase competitive pressure within the internal markets, and this virtuous circle can be achieved in the regulatory place, encourages consumers and businesses to engage in cross-border trade, and this is when also the attack on different national private law starts, less interesting for you. So the language gets stronger, and in 2011 it's even more important what the consumers now have to do. We have this economic crisis going on, and so it is very important that consumers get us out of this by stimulating demand and bringing the EU out of crisis. Shopping should be like mainly online, and there is this reluctance to the extent that the consumers have it needs to be removed by providing right kinds of laws and incentivizing particular kinds of behaviors. So this is how I try to show that there has been a certain shift in imaginary, and now I have a very short fourth part, very short, where I try to just a little bit give you a sense what it actually meant in consumer law. So there are a lot of critiques of all those processes. You know, there are many scholars who have private law scholars, who have from their own corner critiqued what is happening. And there are two major lines of critique, namely who is the subject of this, so what kind of transformation is taking place, and what has been observed by quite a few of them is that the European Commission is very much geared toward creating market useful actors, be it super flexible workers or very mobile workers or very these competent consumers. And I think what Miklit says that is actually quite nice. The internal market needs an active, informed, and adroit consumer. So it is really. He then makes. He of course he is critical. He starts by this, but then it becomes more critical. So now another kind of problem there is that. This also results in certain neglect of not up to speed consumers. So. The consumer policy in the last 30 years has gained ever more prominence. The reason is that because of the privatization of public utilities, from transport to gas to electricity to telecom, a lot more services are supposed to be delivered by means of contracts, and therefore also consumer law protection should somehow apply there. And so at once, this whole idea about this super capable consumer shows really its edges, because many of consumers are not able to live up to the standards of reading all the contracts. Not that I live up to that standard, but that's leaving aside. So not everybody does what they're supposed to do, and therefore, but everybody needs electricity, and would very much not like to live in the society where people don't get heating because they have read their contracts really badly. Or can't understand them. So the new concept of vulnerable consumer emerges, and this concept has been, many have hoped that this is going to be a move to the right direction, me, myself also, especially if we combine it with concepts such as affordability of energy supply, for instance. But ultimately, so far, it is playing mainly the lip service. No much substantive protection has come out of this. The various consumer provisions in the specific sectors refer often to the social security systems, so tax and transfer underlying idea, rather than actually providing real protection. In terms of the second question that we were looking at, namely how does the subject should relate to social whole, so how should be consumers relating to the market? There, the main concern was with information duties, which start to dominate, whereby the businesses are asked to provide very a large body of information to consumers so that they can actually be informed about the purchases that they are doing. And the idea there is that if the consumers are able to get all this information, that we will limit the information asymmetries and remove all the market failures. So good for the consumers, good for the market. Now, problem is that it's of course not very good for consumers because it doesn't work. If it doesn't work for consumers, it also doesn't work for the market. But there is so much enthusiasm about this information policy still that it's very surprising. The Commission doesn't acknowledge that all these behavioral studies in psychology or economics have showed this doesn't work, but and they acknowledge that, but still maybe if we just provide them a little bit differently, things are going to be better. So a lot of policy money is going into how to provide this information in much more effective forms. Another big change is the stress on access to market. as a major social justice concern, let's say. So if I'm to draw on some of the critics of this move, good thing about this access to the market from the perspective of the European Commission and those who believe in the project. Well, this is not going to go out. So those who believe in the project of the internal market as Commission has it in mind in the recent years, at least some part of it, the ones that I'm talking about, is that if we manage to get all the consumers on board, we will have this very vibrant market. So switching is a major interest that the Commission has. If we only are able to switch enough between different energy suppliers, the markets will start operating much better. So if you have not been doing that, please start. The Commission is relying on you. On the one hand, again, it kind of merges these two concerns. So we will have everybody on board, so people will not be left out of the market. That's very bad. And at the same time, it will help the market. However, of course, it is nice that people are part of the market, but of course, the question is what kind of market are they joining in the end? So you should not leave aside the kind of substantive questions of justice within the market and get so enthusiastic only about the access. And this seems to be happening Alexander Somek, for instance, is one of the persons who have been quite critiquing this huge concern with access instead of justice. Okay, so bonus. Do you want bonus?
Of course.
Yes.
How am I doing? Okay, 45 minutes. I'm pretty good. I'm surprised. So I wanted a little bit to reflect on how does this project relate to your project of exploring the links between democracy, economy, and law. And it turns out it's very related to my book. So let me then try to flesh it out. So basically so if we want to think about the role of social change, something that I actually already a little bit mentioned in the beginning, what we need to think really, according to me, about is indeed how law can intervene or disrupt these basic parameters which seem to transgress and bring together the ways we see economy, the ways we see politics and law. And that, of course, has a major impact or a relevance for the project that you are having in mind. So I already mentioned that one way how to go about it is really to think about a different kind of law, but not so much different kind of rules, but different way of imagining what the role of law in the society is. And really, for example, try to bring to the fore an actually normative interventionist law, if you want to say it critically. So this is really, and if you do that consistently over sufficient number of areas, you can actually, I think, bring about broader changes in the society per se. So, for example, one important moment may be this whole artificial intelligence discussion, because there really seems to be a new imaginary of, we should not let this happen in whatever way Google wants it, but rather we should set certain kind of normative expectations prior to those things to the moment when these things start actually taking shape even. So a little bit to the background. So if you think about the way or how Charles Taylor has thought about modern social imaginary, he says that it has three major dimensions. So it has been the pillar of economy, so that when the modern social imaginary emerges, there is this segment of economy which is somehow very much in line with the birth of political economy here, somehow a little bit isolated private sphere where this economic life takes place. Then we have another pillar of the imaginary or modern imaginary, that is the separation between private and public spheres. And finally, the third dimension is that of collective self-determination. So he doesn't mention law too much in his expose. And I would like to add then to his articulation of those three imaginaries that we should really start seeing or bringing law back into the picture and start seeing it as an important mediator between these pillars. So hardly ever would dispute that law has been a major tool to construe the boundary between private and public in family law, in all kinds of law. So repoliticization was basically bringing law within the private sphere. The same goes for the market. So regulation and all those things are some forms of shifting the boundaries between private and public. Law also importantly mediates the relationship between politics of self-determination and economy. So, of course, as you know, the way we have imagined or construed the economy is very much linked to the way we have regulated it. So that is an insight which definitely becomes obvious to many from the beginning of 20th century. So when we think about some of the problems that we have been facing today, especially in the, for example, European Union, but also in all other forms of post-national contexts, we often speak about law somehow as being in conflict with policy. Law overgrowth of law, too much law, too little politics. But I think that, and that will be one of the claims that I will advance in my book, is that it's not that there is too much law and too little politics, but what kind of law has somehow overgrown the politics. So I think to think about this question, we need to first of all look at how, at the things that I've already looked at, but now once again. So how naturalized are conceptions of social reality that law is reacting to? So all those ideas, for example, of law lagging behind, or law not being able to, law which should not address, for example, labor in international context, or WTO saying no, or so all those kinds of things portray certain social reality and create certain boundaries, and to the extent that there is too much of naturalized conceptions of reality within this sphere of government that the law, especially in post-national context, is addressing, and that naturalizations happen in different kinds of ways. Through technocracy, too much stress on science, or particular ways of stress on science, too much expertise, claims that there's something natural about the market, or claims that market is a general good, and there is common interest kind of thesis. So all those imaginaries of the social whole produce a particular kind of facilitative law. And if there is too much of facilitative law, which undermines a basic imaginary, that the basic dimension of modern imaginary, that is that of self-government. So there is a lot of law, but it's law which somehow is serving the nature in its most broadest representations. It's just going to, I would say, engender backlash. And I think, to a certain extent, I really think that the backlash that we are seeing now, and including the post-truth societies, all those things are certain reactions to overtly naturalized and conceptions of the political, in a way. So. First thing, so if it's not the clash between politics and law, it's a clash between particular kind of law which undercuts collective self-determination. That is a problem. And if we want to change this, we need both to reinterpret what the social whole is, so to contest the boundaries which are being set to us, but and foremost, wherever we can, in the fields where this is still possible, to promote a much more interventionist or transformative or properly normative conceptions of law instead of harnessing or facilitative conceptions of law. So that's it. Thank you.